program, we would immediately go ahead so that we don't sort of keep those online and those in-house keep waiting any longer. And I'll briefly introduce our chair, and then she would carry on with the rest of the program. So in our chair today, oh, I didn't even greet you, sorry you, or did I greet you, Grandpa? Okay, so if I didn't, good morning to everybody in house, and also good morning to all those that we have online. And as usual, we always cherish your commitment to join us in the IAS seminar series. You are welcome once again to this morning special seminar. So in our chat, we have Prof. Dumako Ampofu. I'm not going to say any long thing about her. I will just briefly say that she is a professor of African and Gender Studies at the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana, and she's recently appointed as a Wangari Maathai visiting professor at the University of Kassel in Germany. So thus, I would always want to hammer it and keep saying congratulations to Prof. At this moment, I will just hand over to Prof to introduce the chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning also from me to all of you in the room and to everyone online. This morning, it's a singular pleasure. I know that cliche is often used, but I say that very sincerely. It's a singular pleasure to have Mr. Ivor Agyeman-Duah here to talk about his amazing work, I will say, and not to engender jealousy among you, but this is my personal copy. As usual, he has a lot of books, and his books are very fat. They have photographs in it and so on. I'm jumping ahead of myself. But Ivor is, I can say, a family member of the Institute of African Studies, as was his illustrious father as well, and as was Ivor Wilkes, who he is named after. So he comes from a long pedigree of scholars with this institute. He has several interesting works to his name. One that I'm always intrigued with is work that he did with Peggy Appiah and Kwame Appiah on Akan proverbs. So anyway, let me tell you a little more about him. An economic historian and development specialist, Ivor Agyeman-Duah is currently a visiting scholar in history of how do you say, numismatics. Numismatics. You're going to have to tell us what that is. At the British Museum. He served as an advisor to Ghanaian President John Kufuor on development cooperation with the UN World, and also on with the UN World Program, including field works in Kenya and Ethiopia. So Pan-Africanist work, not just doing his research in Ghana. He also worked with the Geneva-based International Peace-Building Organization, Interpeace, which operates in 17 countries, more Pan-Africanism over there. Aside from this, he has been a resident economic research analyst on Rwanda and in soft commodities and redevelopment of cocoa, coffee, and rice in La Côte d'Ivoire and Liberia. More Pan-Africanism there. So we realize that he is eminently placed to talk about issues that concern the continent, Black Africa. I will read a little bit here that from the abstract of today's presentation, because I'm sure not all of you have been able to read this. So the Bank of Ghana was established in 1957 as the Gold Coast became Ghana. Since then, the bank has grown from its 6 inaugural departments to a blossoming organization with 24 departments. The first governor and deputy were English, no surprise, of course, and the second governor came from Germany. Interesting, I did not know that. And the first Ghanaian was appointed in 1962. This volume of 553 pages, 23 chapters, lots of photographs, by the way, looks at Ghana's economic development from its statist confrontation of a vampire state, unquote, as one of the governors tagged it, to its structural changes from the 1960s into the 2020s. The 15 governors to date related with political hawks and doves in periodic state and liberal controlled economies. I'm sure we will be hearing a little bit about that. There were multilateral and creditor engagements, as well as private capital movements, and I dare say movements also. There were multilateral and creditor engagements, as well as, just repeating myself. On some occasions, fraternal census played out with ministers of finance and sometimes egoistical presidents. These were through fratricidal ideological wars on public policy, which led to monetary disequilibrium and on occasions the collapse of governments. So we're not just talking about finance, we're not just talking about money, we're talking about politics, party politics, local politics, international politics, bilateral politics, and international politics. Who are these unelected central bankers accountable to? Tough task. With the sole client, the government of Ghana, in what ways were their technical opinions inconsequential, and where were their powers most visible? And I can already anticipate some of the questions that you are going to be asked. So you are very, very welcome, Mr. Ivor Ajimandria, and the floor is yours.
Good morning. I would like to thank the Director of the Institute of African Studies for the invitation of a special seminar before the formal launch of this book. It is more in keeping with your founding principle. At his inaugural address in the old building across from us, Kwame Nkrumah encouraged the faculty, which included two of your best known, the ethnomusicologist, J.H. Kwabena Nketia, under whose roof we breathe this morning, and the historian Ivor Wells, the father of your former deputy director, Professor Kojo Amano Wells, to do things like this. Philosophical accomplishments and dissemination of knowledge were as important as institutional histories. And so when he officially opened the Bank of Ghana on July 31st, 1957, together with the then acting Governor General, Sir Akokosa, Nkrumah told the gathering of 500 people, including British technocrats from the Bank of England, to work towards using the bank as a development tool. If the Institute of African Studies was an enlightenment facility for African value system, it could only be for nation building, Nkrumah implied on another platform. History, which is always time-defined, comes along with evaluation of ideals, aspirations, visions, and outcomes, including 65 years of the Bank of Ghana, which was initially set up as an issuance of currency outlet. It had an English governor, as the chair said, Alfred Eggleton from the Bank of England, followed by a German professor of economics as a second governor, after which ideological idealism of the 1960s became so strong that the Convention's People's Party regional chairman, without the requisite education, became the first Ghanaian governor. He was more interested in the CPP than he was in the governorship and in monetary policy of the new institution. By this time also, Nkrumah had come to the conclusion that the country will leave the West Africa Currency Board and have its own, the Ghana pound, later the cedi. It was not a happy decision for some, especially as it meant the sovereign head of independent Ghana, Queen Elizabeth, will have her image replaced with Nkrumah's. Nkrumah had explained in a London Daily Sketch article that Ghanaians interpreted visual images better. They were, he argued, happier to see someone like him and of their own image than the Queen on our currency. It was after this currency reorientation in bumpy road with the first Ghanaian governorship, which ended in 1966, that technocrats trained specifically for central banking took over. From Albert Admakon, 2J Frimpong Ansa, Amonikwe, Alessa Shiago, J.K. Agama, Pabnado Fo, Paul Akpa, Pakwesi Emisa Ata, Ufiwampa Asiru, Sekuru, and the current Ernest Addison. This history of the institution and its drivers have been a vital part of Ghana's economic development, from its statist confrontation of a vampire state as one of the governors who once attacked it, to its structural changes into the 2020s. These 15 governors over the period worked with Hawks and Doves, imperialistic and liberal control economists. There were multilateral creditors engagements, as well as private capital movements. On some occasions, fraternal census played out with ministers of finance and sometimes egotistical presidents. These were true fratricidal ideological wars in public policy, which led to monetary disequilibrium and on occasion to collapse of governments. So who, as the chair said, were these unelected central bankers accountable to? For the sole client, the government of Ghana, in what ways were their technical opinions inconsequential? Where were their powers most visible? The attempted answers are as complex as the historiography of this country, which prides itself as the first independent sub-Saharan African nation. This attempt at understanding it comes in this 553-page book of 23 chapters with 28 pages of notes and references. It is published by Hawkers Design and Publishing in the United Kingdom, with the Ghana edition by Digi Books Limited, and a Nigerian edition by Bookcraft in Ibadan. An idea. The idea to write this book originally had to do with an experimental institute for policy and biographical research at the Central University. How do we, as a people, preserve public memoirs was of interest to them. I proposed the central bank, which was accepted. It had been of interest to me personally for over 15 years since I edited an economic history of Ghana, reflections on half a century of challenges, progress, which coincided with the 50th anniversary of the country's independence. The market reception was positive, and the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. used it as one of its references for a policy book, which was on Ghana and was titled A New Era of Transformation. This second work of looking at economic history was more complex. Central banks are conservative by nature, and until its operational independence in 2002, through Act 612 under Governor Paul Akpa, the bank was even more so. It took time for a proposal to be responded to positively, and surprisingly, for agreement that this would be an independently written bank. What was sought was access to the bank's record and cooperation of the staff, from the governor, heads of departments, and facilities like the vaults and money shredding rooms where counterfeits and tied currencies were destroyed daily, as well as security zones. And in addition to this, a research grant that will enable me to go beyond Accra. I knew at that point that the scope of the book will be bigger than the fewer titles before it, such as the Bank of Ghana and the Accra Agenda, Bank of Ghana. The sources of this book were basically primary, archival materials, which included newspapers, magazines, anniversary brochures, but also extensive interviews with some of the civil servants who were part of economic development from the 1960s, and some conversations that I had with 4 of the living governors, or at least documents from them. There were not many alive who had worked at the bank in the 1960s anyway, as it found it difficult to recruit, which accounted for why there were many expatriates, including its board membership. The bank today has over 2,000 professionals, which shows how we've grown as a country. The search for other primary materials took me to the British Museum in London, as I was interested in an examination of old currencies, their symbolism, artworks, and histories, which were consciously very reflective of indigenous concepts of archaeological and architectural material of the bank itself. The earlier Ghanaian governors that included Albert Abmako, J. Frimpong Ansa, who painted in watercolors, collected old maps from around the world, and built computers. Among Nikwe, Alex Ashiago, who read a lot of poetry, were very interested in the arts and especially in history, as some of them had gone to school courtesy of their traditional councils. These interests were part of the primary sources I encountered, not to forget of the fact that the archaeology department of this university, together with other distinguished anthropologists in the 1970s, used archaeology to analyze the development of markets and economic histories in pre-colonial Gold Coast of the 1650s. They were interested in monetary objects, and so in chapter 1, for instance, I partly look at early trade and indigenous monetary systems, the role of money in human affairs, whether among the trade relations of the Ashantis and the Salada people in the Savannah into the Kingdom of Dagon, pre-colonial rule, where palaces and traditional authorities had heads of treasury, what Thomas McCaskey called the great chest of the treasury. In a sense, the contribution of the University of Ghana, in particular, is Department of Economics, where virtually all the governors did their undergraduate studies. No wonder the purpose here is I think the bank gave money for the CD conference center to be built. The department has contributed so much to the manpower development of the bank. Some of the secondary sources I use also came from works by some of the scholars this university and this institute, such as Ivor Wells, who gave great enlightenment to monetary policy in Ashanti in the 19th century. Edu Boain, though at the Department of History, worked closely with others at the institute here at the time, including Professor Peter Shini. Boain had questioned the basis of the Bank of Ghana implementing what he called crazy policies during the military government of Rawlings in the 1980s. And there were many scholars like George Benning, who chaired the board of the bank and was also along the line Minister of Finance during the Women government. The current and the past. It is not surprising for people these days to seek an opinion from me on what is happening at the Bank of Ghana. The assumption is that there may be one or two things that I know. That is a legitimate approach, but I have also responded by saying, if you force or turn current affairs into history, it has a way of rewriting itself. The manuscript of this book was almost done when the governor, Ernest Addison, gave an important speech at the dinner of the Chartered Institute of Bankers in Accra after the mid-year budget review, in which he alerted the nation possibilities of fiscal difficulties. This signal came earlier from the bank than it did in 1965. Many people, including sometimes very partisan policy leaders and media commentators, did not take notice of this. Apart from a critic of the bank, the MP Ajikadongo, who asked Ghanaians to seriously digest, not much of what was referred to by the governor was given in the media. In fact, as one central banker, and former member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the bank, Dr. John Kwachi, says in his book, monetary policy and conclusions will be so complex that it's one area that politicians don't want to know or interfere with. They only do that during crisis. Months passed as they do, and the Minister of Finance, Deno Furata, gave his famous, "We will not go to the World Bank or the IMF" opinion. Is this in the book? Someone asked, and I said, yes, though it is up to a point. The governors are led and the international downgrading of credit ratings that followed. Why not further details on this? This central banker asked again, and my response was that it was unfolding and it would take some time, for a couple of years, for these financial difficulties to settle. And as our self-acclaimed dancehall musician tells us, before we will all move our levels. History, I reminded this friend, has a way of repeating itself. However, I showed him that the role of the IMF has been so dominant that if we look at the conditions that took the country to the fund in 1965, the same prevailed in 2023, this year. We had exhausted all our sources of international borrowing. The capital markets were blocked to us. Internal revenue mobilization was very weak, but our expenditure debt bills had gone overboard. This was 1965, and it was also especially after the commencements of the Kosovo down. Many of Nkrumah's own cabinets, and not just the opposition, as is popular amongst discourse, were not enthused about this, which led to the reassignment of the finance minister at the time, Bedema. It was just like a first cabinet decision against it. Nkrumah had, however, been told by his deputy governor of the Bank of Ghana, that his economy at the time, 1965, had only 3 weeks to survive in terms of import capital. Unfortunately, history has very little to do with policy formulation in Ghana. And so we have policy blindness in which past failures do not stand correction in the current times. 2023 is like 1965. Yet, strong institutions are supposed to have historical antecedents, such that 1965 was to guide 2023. When the United Kingdom's Prime Minister Liz Truss's budget was rejected, the criticism was that it did not have a review from the Office of Budget Responsibility, which has fiscal policy historians who give historical policy on budget opinions going back to centuries. The US Congress has resident specialized historians, and the IMF has introduced historians who are not really even economists, but historians, as we will have them at the Institute here, who look at the institution, human behavior, and human actions and policy, and how they react to things. So the idea is that in classics, as taught here some years ago, whether also at Cambridge or Oxford, had solutions to human behavior more than the economics does. And so they go reverting back to these disciplines at the multilateral institutions, the introduction of historians at the IMF who are not economists, but classicists and others to help humanity to understand human behavior better. If as a country, we do not take into account the past, we will always be hampered. From 1965 through to the Busia devaluation of 1972 to the 17th visitation to the IMF, the fund has not changed its ways and prescriptions because we always go there with the same elements. The cynical ground for debate among the protagonists of these visitations these days, as the politician, is that which government ran to the IMF earlier when the same symptoms showed up. It is almost a quarter of a century since J.H. Frimpong wrote The Vampire State in Africa, the political economy of decline in Ghana. I was influenced by an ancient biblical event in chapter 8 of this book, the central bank in Ghana and the governance, with the choice of a subtitle, The Medium at Endor, and an opinion of how the IMF has been turned into a physical forecast shrine. It's been long, but a time will come soon, I'm sure, when mediums or shrines, stations will cease, and the dawn of the lessons of history will serve a better guide in policy formation, at least in Ghana. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. Another round of applause. I think that this has been a teaser and a foretaste of opportunities for, how do you distill this, into a few minutes? I thought before I open the floor, and it looks like we have a good bit of time, so some preliminary comments from me. I put down some Twitter-sized sound bites that I intend to tweet later on. As he was concluding, he said, which government runs the IMF earlier when it's the same symptoms that ail us? Something to think about in terms of the partisan underbelly of when you're doing economic policy and running a government. And yet the governors are meant to be technocrats who are there. But let me say, what I find fascinating is that this is a study of a state institution, as well as the men, and it has all been men who have run these institutions. And I'm not an historian, but there have been recent debates, I know, in the American Political Association that were, what shall I say, that were engendered by a speech that Professor James Sweet, who actually came to give us a seminar here a couple of weeks ago, brought out in his lecture, where he was trying to provide an overview of where history has been. And so that differentiation, if you like, between metaphysical or postmodernism and then historical aspects of history. And I'm not an historian, so maybe I'm not constructing it adequately. But the sense in which those of us, I guess, in this part of the world really, really need a history of the now and its value in terms of, trying to understand our experiences, but linking it to the past. And it seems that very often we have very short memories. When you listen to young people these days, don't even talk about 1965, even 1989. We lack that appreciation. So this work is a very important contribution, as I see it, in helping us to, and I haven't read it, to understand the institution in its political and economic context, but also providing us a foundation of a larger national and global context within which to read it. And I think that is extremely important. And I don't know how many of our students are paying attention. I was particularly impressed, I don't know if that is the word, thinking, if I heard you correctly, that the Central Bank of the UK makes good use of classicists, and I'm guessing of social scientists as well, so that one is not doing fiscal policy, it's not just the numbers. And I get the sense that between, I don't know about the Bank of Ghana, but looking at the what is coming out of the Ministry of Finance, I get the sense that there's a very very myopic and very limited understanding of, our financial experiences and even the responses to some of what is happening in our social system seems to suggest a lack of appreciation, of the social and of the history. So on that note, I'm going to open the floor to those of my network has gone off. So if yours is still working, so we make sure that we do not lose questions online. So let's take a first round and then we'll let Ivor respond, then we'll do another round. I mean, I'm also, if certain questions don't come up, I will ask them. So I thought there will be a flurry of hands. Yes, Professor Amano. Yes, Director.
Very much for that. I'd like to ask about what differences after structural adjustment to organization of the environment? Within significant difference. Or to put it another way, in a slightly different way, what was the? Are there any significant differences in the in the relationship between military governments and their economic advisors, and then after the establishment of elections, now the relationship between political parties?
Thank you very much. This is very enlightening. At least our students here who are reading history know that they can get jobs outside the mainline teaching that they always are told they can get. But I know that if you look at, I haven't read the book yet, but it is presented in the form of more or less like maybe a biography of the bank. And we know that in an attempt to chronicle things of this nature, there are some issues. I mean, the information you go through a selection process. So I want to know whether at a point in time, you felt that certain issues should not be included in this book. And if so, will you be willing to share with us? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Some few years back, we realized that the IMF is going through certain transformation in terms of its engagement with countries that actually ask or request for assistance. Has there been any changes in terms of the way they engage with the central bank when they've been asked to actually help them to restructure the economy and that kind of thing? Did you perchance maybe see any new form of engagement in terms of the transformation that the IMF has gone through, maybe after the 1980s?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for these questions. I will answer Professor Mano's first, then we'll do the other two questions. We all know the first structural change of the Ghanaian economy was post-independence, when Nkrumah thought that certain things should change, which started with, of course, what image should be on the currency. Industrialization was his goal, and he pursued this against what was happening in the Ivory Coast. The famous disagreement with Ofebuanyi at the time at the United Nations, and even on the continent itself, has been intellectual pamphlets and even in books and anthologies. So that was the first attempt at restructuring the post-colonial economy. The second major one was, of course, the structural adjustment program. And the significance of that was that it was an economic recovery program. The military had been in power for years. We all knew of what the consequences had been. So going to the World Bank and to the IMF came with these demands. And we went through that phase. And people tend to forget that as part of the economic recovery program, there was what was called the financial sector reforms. And that was where a lot of impact occurred. And the financial reforms that came was not only about reforming the central bank, but also the state banks. We only had state banks at the time. How would we as a people be interested in having private banks? So those processes of the banking sector started with a 1982-1983 structural adjustment program. To the extent that this continued and it went on very well. When people talk about the redenomination of the cedi during the Kufuor's time, it was all part of the financial sector reform. And even what Addison did when some of these banks got collapsed were continuation of the financial sector reform. And it also had as an engineer, a former governor of the bank, Alex Ashiago, who had to leave the bank, that's the Central Bank of Ghana, on principle, and went to Geneva, because the UN needed him at the time more than the country needed him. He had had problems with the revolution and had refused to do certain things that he thought were unethical in terms of disclosures of bank accounts of people and of companies and individuals. He preferred that he will resign than to do that. So he left and went to Geneva. And when the country requested for an expert who could help with the financial sector, the UN, he said, well, we have a Shabo in Geneva. So since it's Ghanaian, if you will talk to him. So they talked to him and Ashiago said, yes, I will do it, but do it on my terms and on these principles that any central bank will give. So that happened. He came back and people think he was more successful doing that than the frustrations that he faced as governor of the Bank of Ghana. So the structural adjustment was very critical. And sometimes we also tend to overlook some of the achievements that that regime, Rawlings regime at the time, brought on board in terms of economic development. One commentator has rightly said that it's very ironic that a government military regime that came with the slogan of price control will be the same government that will lay the basis for a market economy between Rawlings and Consequential. So that period was very critical. The second part of the military, the transitions of the military and civilian regimes were also as important, and it defines where we are as a country and where the Bank of Ghana is now. It was not always very easy, and the governors were not as powerful in the 60s and 70s as at least they are now. In the 60s and 70s, there was no operational independence of the bank. That the Act 612 wasn't there to support them. This act only came with the coming into being of Paula. And to some extent, even some people may think that the bank is not as assertive as it should be, but it would have been worse if we never had the operational independence that came in the mid of the 2000s. The second question has to do with your what went into the book, partly biographical, you are right, but also institutional in a way, because we are not only looking at the public policies that came during those the tenures of these people, but who were they? What training did they have to run the bank? And what were their own philosophical approach to central banking in Ghana at the time? is because running a state institution is a continuous thing that public policy demands. Projects are started, policies are floated, but then you don't also have the time as a governor to continue with sometimes the policies that you started. And so you will find, for instance, that in the establishment of the Ghana Stock Exchange, you get 3 or 4 governors whose resumes will read that well. I started with the Ghana Stock Exchange. I did this, I did that. It could be true, it was true, but you check another governor and then you find out that the same session is made in another resume, and the third one you find the same. So who then helped, under whose tenure was the Ghana Stock Exchange established? You realize that they all did bits here and there, but they never stayed on to the end to see the creation of it. So, and it was under Agama that the stock exchange came into being. But then the others had also worked. They had documentations, they had run around the world looking at best practices. So what they had and the inputs that they brought on board were all incorporated into the final document and declaration of the establishment of the Ghana Stock Exchange. So sometimes you need to be also a bit critical. Otherwise, you think that somebody else and not the other created or helped to create. And they are very jealous of things they did and they guide against some of these. And who want to play the other down, that, well, I did the bulk of it. I'll finish with this when this one came. So you have to make a decision, and you have to make a decision based not only on what they are telling you or what their resumes or what other people have written about them, but what the records outside of their own interpretation of those institutions are. And that could be very helpful in determining what goes what. When I found difficulty and didn't have any evidence, even when I was suspicious that other things might have happened, and I wasn't sure because nobody would tell you anything, or people that they didn't know, to be safer to then stick to the limitations of your own curiosity than to write or to argue on something with little basis. So these are some of the limitations. At the end, we're also dealing with human interests. They had their own interests, good as they were, especially very principled, as especially the first 6 of them were. They were prepared to resign. They were prepared to do so much. And Francois resigned based on disagreements with the champion, and Amoniko and others who came also to the same policies. And when the champion said about the same, that your predecessor, they were that, well, our predecessors were right. And so that I don't think you easily find today in our public policy speak, also in our other, they supported each other. I don't know whether it's because they were all born in 1938, about at least the first 4 of them were of the same generation, born in the same year. And so there may be something about that generation, and they are Presbyterian now they were very stand Christians. Some of them even built chapels in their hometowns. And some of them said they were able to go to school because of the traditional councils. So they went back and did so much for their towns, for their villages, before they passed on. So these were some of the things that I was doing. And I think the third one has to do, excuse me, if you will remind me of the third question again. Thank you. So, no, is it okay? I think Ghana was blessed in a way because post-colonial, we had the human capacity of this country was far more than many of the other countries around us. Amonike, who became the governor of the Bank of Ghana along the line, was brought down by engagements at the IMF before he even came down to Ghana. He had his PhD from Harvard and was around the circles of Henry Kissinger at the time, meeting people like that. But J.H. Mensah's argument was that the country needed you more than the meeting with Henry Kissinger and others in the capitals of the world. So he came down, and since then, we've had many Ghanaians who have worked at the IMF and the World Bank. And I remember when I visited the bank in 2005, between the World Bank and the IMF, there were 200 Ghanaians working between these two institutions. Some managers, the directorate level. So we've always had some level of association with the bank. And the current first deputy governor of the bank, Marshal Okua Ferry, had worked at the World Bank, at the IMF for 9 years before he came back as the first deputy governor. I met him in Rwanda, where they respected him so much for his technical skills, because he was then doing the debt sustainability analysis for the government there. So not that we work with them, but we have personnel, we have the capacity that will understand them better. And that capacity, which is also localized now, could be capacity that, if sometimes allowed, could help in the improvement and in the monetary policy framework or architecture that we have. So yes, the bank and the IMF have had influences over the years, especially the IMF. But sometimes these are also programs drawn not just by the IMF as a unanimous institution, anonymous institution, but sometimes with inputs from Ghanaians who are working at the institutions. Paul Akwa was director at the African department at the IMF for many years, working in 15 or so other African countries, and was consulted extensively before he even became governor in Cape Coast on some of the monetary policies and some of the programs that Ghana should have. So yes, we've worked with them, but it's better to sometimes also listen to our own who have the same expertise and are capable and have done similar works and improved economies of other countries than to always think that going back to Washington and dealing with others will be better off than what we have.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read a question online. I mean, listening to your responses, you know, I think of the notion that a prophet is not valued in their hometown. I mean, I'm sure we all know, or some of us might do, you know, colleagues who worked in one ministry or the other here, hard time pushing through ideas that they think are beneficial to the country. They leave and work with, in this case, the World Bank or the IMF, and then they have to deal with their former counterparts here who are still in the ministry, and they suddenly find that they have a little bit more expanded space in order to, you know, to push the policies that when they worked here were not regarded, sadly. Anyway, there's a question here from Dr. Edemadote online. I think you partially answered it, but I will still read it. He says, thank you for this important work on Ghana's history. What were some of the methodological challenges, particularly with archival sources, knowing some of the issues with preserving written records? And then he also adds, he looks forward to reading the book. Any other question? If not, we'll take a response to this one whilst your thoughts are crystallizing.
Thank you. The Central Bank of Ghana is a very conservative institution, as I said. And it's not only our central bank, but all central banks, I realize, are like that. They don't come out to explain. In a way, it's like the Buckingham Palace's response to issues. Don't explain, don't respond. And it's, in a sense, becomes sometimes difficult to know what it is that you can get access to or not. By way of the methods that I used, I met with the governor after the bank accepted that they will want somebody from an external source look at the history of the bank, the way it's been done now, because it had not been done previously. And the agreement was, we'll give you access, you talk to the governor, we will let you talk to the former governors, we will let you talk to the heads of department. And so letters were even written to these heads of department. And even when the letter had been written by the secretary of the bank, who's like the general manager of the bank, they were still called to cross-check if the letters were letters coming from her. And of course, she said, yes, these are letters coming from her. This is a management decision that an independent assessment of the bank should be done. And I must say, they were very gracious. That my point was, there's no need of discussing the content with you. There is no need of discussing anything with you. All I will need is talking to some of the people that I need to talk to, some of your old staff that I may have access to, and they agreed to all of this. And they never asked me to see the manuscript. They never did anything. And at one point, when these current crisis popped up, I think they got a bit worried. They were not so sure what the content of the book would look like. So I got a few calls, and then I showed them that, well, I'm not talking about the current crisis because it will take a while before it settles down. And it will also take other people who are interested in the current situation to know what the issues were. Because we have had a situation where the Minister of Finance was telling us that we're not going to the IMF. And within a month, we went to the IMF. So you don't write a history of an institution that way. The temptation was to also look at an epilogue. And I realized that looking at an epilogue when the manuscript was almost ready was like a continuation of the last chapter. So I decided that, well, I wouldn't do that at all. And then look at what the future brings. And if there will be a second edition of this book, we'll then look at what happened between that period and the time that the second edition will come out. So yes, there were some challenges in terms of the photos used. They were gracious, I must say, and they gave so much access to what they wouldn't normally give. There have been people at the bank who've worked there for 30 years. They haven't been to the shredding room. They haven't been to the vault where the monies are kept. They took me through, of course, under tight security. And there are more security cameras at the bank than there are human beings working at the banks. It's also an interesting experience to have.
Thank you so much. Let me ask a question then for the benefit of our students of history, but all of our students. And we started a biography project in this institute, which well, maybe is limping along a little bit. Too many crises in our nation. But you know, from a research scientist perspective, how do you? It's about an institution, but it's also about individuals. How did you approach the biographical part? You were talking about records at the bank. Did you speak to family members of any of the living people? I mean, we know some of these individuals, or we know of them. There are all kinds of stories about, you know, all of them. Some are personal stories, some are stories about their work. They may be true, they may be half true. How did you, you know, approach that aspect of the work?
I think that's a very important question because you can't pretend to know some of these individuals better than their families. So I spoke to family members. I got some family documentation. Some of them had written about experiences, about their views, like Ashabo, who had a collection of essays on aspects of banking. And some of them also had written articles before they even became governors. So these were very important materials to review. And then some of the family people were also a bit suspicious. They were not so sure what it is that you want to write. Beloved, is it going to be too critical? In which sense there was no need talking to you at all? It would be better for them to rest in peace than to bring up things that may be unpleasant. But then you talk to people, and then even those who were critical of others because they were not there to answer to some of these, were very respectful of disagreements with them. I went as far back as to mention, talk about Albert Admakum, because he had been able to go to Cambridge University on the Asante Maya scholarship scheme with the Asante Independent II had instituted at the time. And then when he came back, he was as loyal to the bank as he was also to the Asante Maya, because throughout, he said that had it not been that scholarship, he wouldn't have been able to become a governor. And so he did so much. So there were records there because he also chaired the Golden Jubilee of the Asante Maya Confederacy Council. And there were things he said, there were things he wrote, there were interviews about his governorship that he granted to the JBC at the time, and the tribute that the Asante paid him when he died at the age of 95, the longest of them all, gave insights as to their character, their own challenges, and some of the things that they went through. So family, of course, very critical. I visited some of the family homes, like Monique's family, around the Jamestown area. It's called Victorian House, and it's very curious why Victoria will have an honor or place in Jamestown. And I realized that there are Monique's that have a long civil service family experience, grandfathers, and others had been in the Gold Coast civil service. So he was just in line of a long family history. Some of them had even gone to Lagos as civil servants. There was this exchange of the colonial system. So Ghanaian civil servants could go to Nigeria to work in the Nigerian civil service. And then so I realized that the Victoria Island, or the Victorian House, was about one of them who lived in Victoria Island in Lagos, who fell in love with the area. And so when he came, that is his uncle, decided to name the house Victoria House, reminiscent of his time in Lagos. So these little details will sometimes also lead you to a long, distinguished families of civil servants that otherwise you wouldn't know if you just strictly want to look into the biographical details of an individual. Family is, of course, central to many of the things we do, and family, talking about one of their own, was critical today.
Very interesting. And disclaimer, please. The late Albert Adumaku, no relative of mine. There's also an H at the end of his Adumaku, I believe, right? Yeah. Yes. Any? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to find out, you said when the bank was established, 2 expatriates manned the bank before indigenous governance took over. And I want to find out, during your data collection, maybe secondary and then interviews, whether you got information concerning the styles of these governments, the differences between the expatriates and then the indigents, and the implication for the growth of the bank. The other question that I would like to find out is, you said that when Nkrumah wanted to change the currency and therefore he had to bring his own image and then drop the Queen's image, there were some form of misunderstanding, if I should put it that way. But what I want to find out is when eventually he succeeded, I know by then Ghana had attained independence, but would you say it was one of the woes that contribute, let me say woes in the sense that, do you think removing the Queen's image from the currency and eventually putting Nkrumah's own image, could it have been a factor that also deepened the animosity that eventually led to his overthrow? Thank you so much.
Thank you. The expatriates who were in, the first governor and the deputy governor, were English, and they came with the traditions of the Bank of England. That was where they had been trained. That was where they had worked. And if they had any experience of central banking at all, it was from there that they came to Ghana with. From the very beginning, the bank couldn't get enough Ghanaians to even fill certain positions. And John Maynard Keynes, the great economist of the last century, who had also helped with the setting up of the Central Bank of India, had said to the Bank of England that because decolonization was inevitable, other colonies with time will need the services of the Bank of England. So the spread out should be thought through carefully, so that it wasn't a matter of Ghana says, well, we need about 10 central bankers, and then the Bank of England will give 10 central bankers. It may come a time where the colonies, post-colonial economies, will need more central bankers, which the Bank of England could not provide. So the deputy governor came. He was in the US when Bedema and others in need of second deputy had to talk to London. And so he came from New York. He was with the Federal Bank in New York. And he was 39, and he was specifically to look at the markets. His area of specialization was the capital markets. So he was in, and there was still a struggle. The country needed a second governor, but they couldn't get it from the Bank of England. And some of the board members had also been brought from the Bank of England. CEO Say, who was the father of the current chief of staff, was one of the people appointed to the board of the bank, about 3 or 4 of them. Otherwise, they were all English from England with experiences to run the board and to impart knowledge to the new board members who were Ghanaian. So they brought things that we didn't have. And after 2-3 years, they also advised that we should do certain things. The deputy governor, Stone, said, and it came out of a prophecy, that if Ghana refused at the time to develop its own capital markets, 50-40 years from now, the country will have difficulties because they will have nowhere to go to than to go to external capital markets. And he did this through a broadcast to the nation on GBC radio, that he will not be in Ghana for long. Eventually, he will have to go. But the country should focus on developing its own markets, external markets, and he even spoke of a stock market that it should be developed within the next 5 to 10 years, as he was advocating. And that if we fail to do these things, the structural, financial architecture will be dependent with time on external forces, external markets. And I think if we look at what is happening now, because it took over 30 years for the Ghana Stock Exchange to be developed, it took us that long, by which time the external markets have been by advanced in terms of our borrowing, in terms of what we could do with them. So they had good intentions. Some of them had good intentions, but they left eventually because of the Africanization policy of the Nkrumah government. So within the next 10 years or so, when the bank was founded, Nkrumah was in a hurry for Ghanaians to take over. So the first governor left 2.5 years into his job. The second governor, professor of economics, also left 2.5 years or so. But he had also instituted a scheme where Ghanaian central bankers should be trained in Germany to add value to the capacity that was in the country at the time. So one, it was Africanization policy of the Nkrumah government that also speeded up the entry of Ghanaians into the central banking system. The second part of the image, I think it was inevitable. And Nkrumah said that if we are independent, we should be independent. And by doing that, he also had the Republican status in mind, that we will be Republican anyway. So the earlier the better. So the image change was something that was bound to come. At that time, all the colonies, whether in the Caribbean or across the continent of Africa and wherever the empire was, the instruction from the colonial office was that the currency image should be on all currencies. So Nkrumah was in a hurry. The Republican status, of course, closed all this and then made the currency more Ghanaian as he saw it.
Thank you, Alpha. Fascinating stuff. We can take a couple more before we bring the curtain down. So there's any other hands?
What will you make of the recent concern expressed by people like Dr. Kwachi of the IEA in terms of the banks breaking in its own acts by borrowing so much money to government and vis-a-vis the independence of the central bank?
The interesting part is Dr. Kwachi has, for years, was on the monetary policy committee of the Bank of Ghana. I think he's a very distinguished economist. He was also at the IMF for about 10 years. In fact, he did so well for the country when he was at the IMF that certain changes that occurred within the structure. You know, the IMF has about 27 constituencies, 23 or 27. And each member of the IMF belongs to one of these constituencies. And John was a special advisor to the executive director of the Ghana constituency. And it was through that arrangement that he also made sure, of course, in consultation with the Ministry of Finance, that there will be a rotation which will allow somebody from the Bank of Ghana to spend at least 4 years at the IMF, and then someone from the Ministry of Finance 4 years at the World Bank. So it's a rotational thing, and it's been going on for close to 2 decades. So somebody's views are respected. But then Amonikwe, when Edubuahin said that he doesn't understand why the Bank of Ghana was implementing crazy policies during the Rawlings era, Amonikwe's response, and Amonikwe, of course, had been a governor of the bank, had said that until there is the independence of the central bank, and that politicians will allow central banks to do what they're supposed to do, it will be very difficult for the central bank to operate technically as it should be, and that there wouldn't be any independence anywhere for any central bank until that correction was done. And if you look at what happened even last year in Turkey, it's been the same. The governor of the Central Bank of Turkey insisted that certain things should be done. Got sacked. And then the effect there was that immediately the announcement of his departure was routers and others. The stock exchange virtually fell. Trust in the governor was more than in the president of Turkey at the time. So commodity prices collapsed. And then the idea came up from the opposition that, well, we must rather restore the dignity of the bank by bringing in the governor than allowing the president to be at his post. So it also depends on the independence of the bank and how sometimes politicians will allow that to be. But for Amonique, it was virtually an impossible situation. And if we look at what happened in the UK, the bank had to step in when Kwesi Kwarteng's budget led to the fall of the collapse of the British, virtually the British economy. The Bank of England had to step in and to buy the bonds because they said it will rather lead to the collapse of the whole British economy. It was a monetary policy decision that they took, and they were not supposed to do that. But then a central bank would or cannot also stand on its grounds and say that, well, the economy is collapsing, the politicians want to do this, and that as governor of the Senate, I will not permit this to happen. Technically, you may be right, but practically, what you have to overcome may be too much than you can handle. So it's all a sort of a contest between the independence of the central bank, which will be nominal, the power of the physical authorities that governments who always say they've been elected. Government is also appointed technically by the executive, will have implications on how you behave or misbehave. And if we go back even to what happened with President Mahama, to leave the bank, nation address, when he said that the responsibility of the microfinance companies that took people was squarely the responsibility of the supervision division of the Bank of Ghana, and that the bank should answer. This was in the State of the Nation address. And 3 weeks or so after, the governor had to tender in his resignation to go to see the president, Mahama, and to let him know that he should find a successor to the Bank of Ghana. That can be as he was yes about it. If you decide sometimes not to compromise, the option will be then to leave, to resign, which a couple of them did in the past. H. Dupont did, and Shago also left based on this agreement with the central government.
I'm reminded of the central bank that permitted cash to be flown to Brazil on behalf of, defying all their own regulations, and that was a very sad story. It was less about the physical survival of the nation. I guess these days the principle of resigning has become unfashionable. You just soldier on against all odds and place your principles somewhere in the background. Any last question before? Oh, okay. So there's a question online. So this is from Tando. Salahuddin Tando says, congratulations for the great contribution. I know I will definitely read the book soon, but in the meantime, I wish to hear your perspective in case it came up in your research. How would you describe economic planning, namely, I guess, vis-a-vis the roles and functions of the Bank of Ghana, the National Development Planning Commission, and the Ministry of Finance? Have you established any gaps in this subject area in the book or in the process of writing it? And then we tag onto it, how long did this entire research take you?
It's about a year and a half. It was fast track, and I don't think I want to do something like that again. Spending 5 hours, 6 hours a day at a particular time, researching and writing this book. And I must also acknowledge the presence of Jacob Mali. I've worked with Jacob. Jacob is a visual anthropologist at this university, and he did the digital photography that you'll find in this book. I've worked with him on a couple of other projects. He's been traveling all around the world.
doing some of these for embassies, for foundations. And young as he is, I think he's an inspiration of what this university can also produce. Everywhere he's been to. Yes, Jacob. He's been acknowledged internationally, and for me, he was recommended to me by a professor at this university, and we've worked together on very good projects, 2 or 3 very big projects. And I'm grateful for his discipline and also for his advice on some of the visual images that he will recommend. But going back to what question came up just moments ago, planning had always been part of the earlier economic strategies of this country. J.H. Mensah was the first Ghanaian economist who was also in charge of the planning. He had worked with the distinguished economic historian and also economist, W. Atta Lewis, who was Nkrumah's advisor. He come from the UNDP, and he will later win the Nobel Prize in economics. J.H. Mensah worked with him, aspects of planning, and they planned the economy for the 7-year development plan that came up, the 5-year development plan. And at that time, planning, of course, was the mainstay of many economies of the open world. And the Constitution now provides that there's a planning commission. But as we all know, the planning commission is very weak, and they themselves will tell you that they have a very weak commission because the composition will change with virtually every election. So every election will bring in new commissioners, bring in new planners. So there is no continuity of long-term policy work. And those that have been done, whether by Nimue or whether even by J.H. Mensah and others, were overthrown as soon as a new regime had been in place. So long-term planning is a difficulty here, unlike, for instance, in Kenya, where it's part of the Constitution and is independently tapped in as part of the constitutional document, so that every party or every government that comes to power, you have to find policies that can be absorbed by the planning and the long-term planning that is being given you. So you can't just say, I want to build 100 schools, I want to do this number of hospitals, when it's not in the medium to long-term planning by the commission, which is independent. It will be overthrown, and then your budget will not virtually be approved, and there'll be agitation around it. So you go to Kenya, and the planning, the public policy is normally within the sphere of the planning commission. It's not the case here. And until we also look at the Constitution, and many people who have been talking about constitutional reforms are talking about this in particular, because there's no long-term plan. The commission is powerless in doing this.
On that not so high note, I don't want to use the other adjective. If there are no other questions in the audience or online, we will bring the curtain down. I think you can agree with me that this has been a very edifying, illuminating presentation. You know, we all have some bits of information and understanding and some tuli and some filler, but you know, and what we've heard this morning is just the tip of the iceberg, I can imagine, from this text. So I hope it is also gingering our students in terms of thinking about how we do our research. You know, we don't have to be historians, and we don't have to be economists to think and to appreciate and to ask certain questions and to explore them, and you know how to do that. There's a certain amount of interdisciplinarity in your work, triangulation, that is important. We don't want to throw the disciplines away. They are important, but it is also important for our work to be in conversation with other ways of doing things. And so I think, apart from the content, which is fascinating, the methodological approach is also very innovative, intriguing, and should encourage us, all of us as scholars, to think outside the box. So on that note, I will thank you very much for having graced us with your presence and with this opportunity. And we will think about, I know that there's a book launch due, which is when?
I think the Institute has been progressive in many ways. And the Institute, of course, contacted us, the publishers and the author. And together with the Bank of Ghana, there will be a formal launch of the book. And the bank has agreed that we do that with the Institute, since the Institute showed initial interest in this. So we do this with the Institute and also have it planned. They were thinking of Kempinski. And since it's not a commissioned work of the bank, I think we will do that with the Institute and then collaborate with the bank as well. So it doesn't come across as a commissioned book of the bank. So it comes in good stead that you approach us and you have a good address for us to do this with you. And we will do a similar one in Nigeria as well. So maybe it will also open other ways for you to ensure institutional collaboration. The publisher is here, the Ghana edition, the publisher, Mr. Labi, Fred Labi. And I think he's also decided that he will give 2 copies of the book to the Institute's library and as a goodwill gesture.
Thank you so much. And DigiBooks is no stranger to the Institute, and they have worked with us. The most recent one was, which was the most recent? There are autobiography, or our biography, not autobiography. The biography series was also published by DigiBooks. So they are our friends. Yes, I don't know what, would you like to say a few words? Or you will do the pre. Please come. Let's take the opportunity for a photo op, and then we will also allow you to perhaps say a few words. I think we have a bit of time just a few words on the whole process of working together. I know that this is the Ghana or the Africa edition, but the process of doing that publication. So please join us. I think the director needs to come.
I think he is giving us.
It's an honor to donate this book to your library. And I'm hoping this will be part of the collaboration between us and the Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, DigiBooks. And I know our students will put this to very good use. But I also want to thank the author and to introduce him in a very special way. It appears many of us don't know him. I think he's already mentioned that he's a son of one of our researchers. If you have, yes, Mr. Ajimenduya, he collected our stool histories. And these documents have become very critical in Asante jurisprudence. Usually, when Asante is going to pass judgment about disputes in relation to land and chieftaincy, in most cases, these documents are consulted. Apart from that, he personally, Professor Kosad Marco knows where I'm going, he also knows where I'm going now. He instituted an award in this Institute of African Studies in honor of his father. So sooner than later, he's going to kickstart it again. Usually first year master's students, the student that tops the class is usually given a cash award. And he is the one who instituted it. And yes, he deserves that. He is going to start again. He's just told me and this time in a very different way. So we are very grateful to you for this kind of initiative. Actually, when I think that was, the award was in its second or third year. And we're all fighting hard to get that award. So thank you so much. So he's not new to us at all. His father has worked here and retired here, and his money is also working here. So thank you so much. We are very grateful.
Thank you, Director. Thank you, Publisher Digibooks, Mr. Labi, and thank you all. And I will give the last word to our coordinator, but Mr. Ajimandria, thank you so much for being with us this morning. It has been really very edifying. Thank you. So last round of applause for our speaker and for your good selves. And our coordinator gets the last word.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ajimandria. And I would especially want to say a very big thank you to Director Prof. and Prof. Amano. I think the whole thing started with them. So really appreciate that urge to get the researcher to be here. Thank you very much. And to all colleagues online and those in-house, we say a very big thank you for, as usual, honoring our invitation to the seminar series. Next week promises to be another very engaging week. We have 2 events coming on right here in this seminar room on Thursday. So on Thursday morning, we have an exhibition which is themed Slavery Resistance Narratives in Northern Ghana. And this would be on 16th March at 9 a.m. right here in the seminar room. And in the afternoon, we have our usual research seminar when we have Dr. Pitana make a presentation on institutional clash in natural resource management. Gushegu in focus. So we have 2 events on Thursday, right here, one in the morning and then one at noon. I would send the invitation and the necessary information in due course. Thank you very much and hope to see you again next week. Thank you.